Well, good morning, Rouse Hill Bible Church. How are you? This is so exciting. It's exciting because I get to stand up here with a friend, but also exciting just to see all of you and be able to share this moment with you today. So it's just wonderful to be back. I hope you enjoy every moment of this time, and so it's just a really special time that we have together. So for those of you who don't know me, my name is Russ Matthews. I'm a part of the leadership team here at the church. Also, we want to welcome everybody in the room next door, and also for those who will be watching here later on today. Thanks so much for being a part of Rouse Hill Bible Church today. Now, one of the things I get to do that's a real honor for me is I get to introduce our speaker today. Because the speaker is not only someone who I admire, but also is a good friend. And so, and one of the things, as Ben was sharing earlier about the whole pandemic experience, we work together, Martin and I work together, but we haven't seen each other in months except for on Zoom calls. And so I'm actually going, I get to touch and everything like that. This is great. So, but also what's great for me is we get to share something a little bit more than we even get to experience sometimes in the workplace. It's going to find out a little bit more. So what I wanted to do is I'm going to ask Martin 3 questions, but hopefully that's just the start of the conversation, because after his talk, he is going to be around, so if you'd like to find out more or talk with him or ask him other questions, I encourage you to do so, okay? So, Martin, come on up here. All right, hopefully you can hear me okay. You can speak in the mic. So, Martin, tell us a little bit about yourself. You have a fascinating history. I know we probably don't have time to go into it all, but you want to just kind of give us a brief history of kind of where you've come from in the past, and where God has you now.
Sure. I always find this question tricky to answer because I haven't really lived in one particular place in my life. So I'm Korean, Canadian, Australian in that order. So I was born and raised in Korea, left Korea when I turned 14. Lived in Toronto, Canada as an international student, and I became a permanent resident, a Canadian. But when I turned 25, I decided to try something different. Decided to come over to Melbourne to do some further studies.
Oh yeah.
And I got seriously distracted from my commitment to study, so I met a girl who's not my wife. Her name is Pearl. So I got married, ended up settling in Melbourne. And had 2 kids, Nathan and Jemima, who are in year 8 and year 5.
Right. All right, great. Well, and they're busy today because they've got stuff going on with their church today, right? Because normally they probably would join you, but they've got a lot of things going on. So thankfully, where do you go to church? Just to kind of go through.
Yes, I go to church in the city, in the heart of CBD, called Scots Presbyterian Church, just outside Wynyard Station.
Yeah. Oh, you really need to kind of dig into that story a little bit if you have the opportunity, because it's really kind of almost a replant in a way, wasn't it? Because it was a mass. It's this huge church, but then it kind of closed down for a while, and then they've restarted it. It's really exciting to be a part of that. All right, so now probably the next question I have for you is, tell us about your faith journey. You kind of told us your physical journey, but tell us a little bit about your faith journey. How is it that you became a Christian?
So even though I did come from a Christian household, I think I really had a serious identity crisis when I came over to Canada. As a 14-year-old boy, as you can imagine, without speaking a word of English, there was a serious cultural, but also like a serious identity crisis. And, I was just sitting in a library one day and reading through the Bible, as a good Asian kid would do. And I was reading through the Gospel of Luke, and towards the end, at chapter 23, I came across a story of 2 criminals hanging next to Jesus. And there, I think that story somehow was seared into my memory as I was reading through it, reading about the claims of Jesus and hearing about what Jesus had done. And there he was on the cross, and he's got 2 other guys, next to himself. And what Jesus does on that cross really, really spoke volumes about who he was and who he claimed to be. I mean, there he was actually one of the criminals who repented last minute. And he was asking, remember me when you come into your kingdom. And what Jesus says is actually, today you'll be with me in paradise. And to me, that actually proved who Jesus said who he would be. I mean, there he was, hanging on the cross, probably a lot in pain, and, having his last breath. And there he was, saving people. And that context really, to me, that really spoke volumes about who Jesus claimed to be. And I think at that point, I decided to identify myself as a Christian, as a follower of Jesus. And I think that may have been a turning point. I can't remember specifically, a point in time, but I think that story really was seared into my memory, and I don't think I looked back ever since.
Yeah, right. Oh, praise God. Thanks for sharing that. I can't wait to kind of find out more about that myself. Now, last question before, because it's probably we really want to get to hearing your talk, is you have been with City Bible Forum for 4 years, right? So Martin and I have worked together for 4 years, and so it's really been exciting to kind of see all the different things that he does. So I want to hear a little bit about that, but also, could you step back just a little bit? What did you do before that, and how is it that you ended up kind of working for, deciding to work for City Bible Forum?
Yeah, after uni in Toronto, I started my career in banking, and I came to do some further studies in that sort of field in Melbourne. So ended up working in investment banking, sort of consulting industry for quite a number of years in Melbourne. But I think being a Christian in the workplace had been really tough for me. I've had some really tough colleagues who would challenge me for my faith. And I used to struggle quite a lot. I wouldn't say I excelled in sharing my faith with my colleagues. I did struggle quite a lot in terms of navigating how do I get this saving message across. So I think those sort of struggles over time led me to think about what can I be doing to encourage other Christians around me to do similar things, and started thinking about workplace ministry. And that's what City Bible Forum does, my employer. So I decided to come down to Sydney for proper sort of theological training, and here I am.
There you go. We're thrilled, and we're so glad to have you here today. So I hope you enjoy the talk, but make sure to take some time to get a chance to get meet Martin. He'll be around for a while afterwards, and look forward to hearing what you have to say. Thanks so much for being here today, brother.
Thank
All
you.
right, thanks,
guys. So it's so good to be here in a physical church. I'm actually back in a physical church before, I get to attend my own. Very exciting. So if you can, please, open up your Bible on your device, or if you have a physical Bible, that'd be good. I'm going to be making references to certain verses throughout the talk. But again, my name is Martin from City Bible Forum. Thank you so much for having me. I mean, so much has changed in the last couple of weeks, I think. Shops are open. We can finally meet friends and families again. But despite all the easing of restrictions, I suspect that we all face a slow road to recovery. And I'm not just talking about just economics here, but the state of our mental and spiritual health. One of the mental scars I'm trying to recover from is my pessimistic outlook. When meetings and events began to be cancelled because of the lockdown, when people started dropping out of my prayer groups in the city, I couldn't really help myself but feel quite discouraged. So I think I gradually started to lower my expectations. I think being pessimistic made it easier for me to cope with my disappointments. Never did I think that this pessimistic outlook would have an adverse spiritual impact in the way that I live out my faith. At a weekly City Bible Forum team meeting, we normally share one thing we're thankful for. And some time ago, I began noticing how I'm struggling to come up with just one genuine Thanksgiving prayer point. There were plenty of things to grumble about, but when it comes to praise points, a Thanksgiving point, I had to dig deep. And during the pandemic, I got myself in the habit of talking about things that I'm disappointed about than the things I'm thankful for. Whether it be politics, people, or policies, I think it's been much easier to point fingers, blame, and grumble. No wonder the Bible reminds us in so many places to be thankful. Restoring mental and spiritual health requires time, effort, and discipline. And I suspect many of you who've had similar experience to mine will keep experiencing setbacks and disappointments along this slow road to recovery. So what can we do not to lose heart? So what does the Bible teach us about not losing heart? So before we go into the passage in a bit more detail, let me put the current pandemic in context by comparing our situation to the one that Apostle Paul would have faced in 2 Corinthians 4. We've been in and out of lockdowns for more than 18 months. And over that period, challenges of mental health, loneliness, and social isolation have taken its toll on all of us. But when Apostle Paul was doing his ministry, he was in prison for over 5 years. I'm not talking about lockdowns with access to internet, YouTube, and Netflix. No TikToks. And I'm sure being arrested in his time looked very different from all the privileges and perks we take for granted in our modern lifestyle. And as we live through the pandemic, being able to spend more time with your family has clearly been one of the positive things that COVID has brought about. I say this even if you may be having more arguments and frictions with certain members of your household. Relational conflicts and struggles are a lot easier to manage when you know deep down that they love you and that you love them in return. Apostle Paul, on the other hand, was in a bitter conflict with some people in Corinth who wanted to destroy him. They were firmly opposed to Paul's ministry. They were like the keyboard warriors of the first century, faceless men who were determined to destroy him. They accused Paul of trickery, deception, and lies. They were spreading toxic rumors about him, accusing him of preaching the wrong message. Paul was deeply hurt. And perhaps it would have been far easier for him to call it an early retirement or stay out of, from all the vile and nasty people. But as we read from chapter 4, Paul's attitude to his Christian ministry was not to lose heart. What can we learn from Paul? What can he teach us about persevering in our own Christian ministry, whether it be at home, church, or virtual work environment? So today I'd like to share 3 reasons from the passage why we should not lose heart, and 3 tips on how we can thrive in our Christian ministry as we live through the pandemic. So let's begin with 3 reasons not to lose heart. So firstly, Paul did not lose heart because he saw his ministry as God's mercy. In his early days, Paul actively persecuted Christians. So perhaps he may have felt God's mercy with greater intensity, that his ministry was mercifully given to him when he didn't really deserve it. But if you look at the way the Bible describes us, we have no reason to expect that we are any better than Paul. According to Romans 5, we were all God's enemies. We were all once alienated from God and were hostile, according to Colossians. The more you reflect on this great divide between what we once were and what we've become in Christ and because of Christ, the more you're aware of the great privileges that you enjoy as God's children and as a co-heir of Christ. There is so much more reasons to marvel at the scope and the scale of God's mercy. I've heard many Christian workers share about how opportunities for evangelism have evaporated. They've dried up because of little or no physical interaction with non-Christian friends and colleagues. Personally, I've had the same experience. A few non-Christian guys that I used to catch up over coffee to read the Bible together have asked me to stop. And to be honest, I found it quite disappointing. But do you know what I find really interesting? In the last 18 months, when no one turned up to our City Bible Forum office, when I was no longer catching up with people over coffee, I've seen a remarkable increase in the number of non-Christian engaging with our online outreach events and Zoom Bible discussion groups. I'd love to think that it's because I'm a gun evangelist that we're seeing this rise in the interest, in Christian faith. But the truth is that it's probably got nothing to do with my own abilities or skills or plans. As Paul begins chapter 4, he's brutally honest about why we shouldn't fret about our own Christian ministry stalling or going backward. In his mercy, God lets undeserving sinners like you and I to be his children and proclaim the gospel. And when we do so faithfully without distorting his word, God draws his people to himself. Paul explains this really well in verse 6 by taking us back to the original plan and design God had in mind at the beginning of all things. Just like God let the light shine out of darkness as he did at creation, God is the one who makes his light shine in people's hearts and give the saving knowledge in the face of Jesus. Times like this, I think, is a great reminder for us all to witness how God works according to his mercy. God's mercy is the one that lets undeserving sinners like you and I to share the gospel with those who need it. And it's because of God's mercy that the lost can be found under God's own plan and purpose, just like we were once graciously rescued. When we begin to see our ministry as God's mercy, we can take heart. So secondly, Paul did not lose heart because he knew the source of power in ministry. In verse 7, if you look at verse 7, Paul likens our feeble human body to jars of clay. Something that can be easily broken, subject to decay, vulnerable to disease and injury, as we've seen through COVID-19 pandemic. Jars of clay are not something you describe as being powerful. But the point Paul wants to make is that there is power in weakness, because these jars of clay carry what he calls this treasure. If you look at verse 7, he makes a reference to this thing called this treasure. What does Paul mean by this treasure? Well, take a look back at the preceding verse, verse 6. This treasure actually refers to the knowledge of God's glory displayed in the face of Christ. I'd summarize this as the gospel. There is power in weakness because this treasure called the gospel is the source of God's all-surpassing power. Paul reminds us that we have no reason to lose heart, even as fragile jars of clay, because we carry the treasure called the gospel to wherever we go. And Paul's honest assessment of who he is, namely the fragile jars of clay, and what he carries in his own body, namely powerful gospel, lets him come to a surprising confession in verses 8 and 9. We may be hard-pressed but not crushed, perplexed but not in despair, persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. The gospel we embody is what enables us to persevere all kinds of trials, suffering, and pain. If you ever felt ashamed for sharing your faith or for even acknowledging that you are a Christian, I think you're in a good company, because I've done it so many times myself. We're not immune to the temptation of feeling ashamed of the gospel. When your device's battery is running low, have you ever sort of plugged the charger and still let your device die? And I do it so many times. It happens because I forget to turn on the power switch. To God's people living under pressure, Paul reminds us not to be mistaken about the true power source. The power source is not our public debating skills or persuasive rhetoric, but the all-surpassing power of the gospel itself. This is why Paul can say in Romans 1, I'm not ashamed of the gospel, for the gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. It is the power, gospel is the power of God that brings salvation to everyone who believes. Later in that book, in the letter of 2 Corinthians, Paul goes on to say that my power is made perfect in weakness. He says something strange. My power is made perfect in weakness. Paul's words only make sense when you begin to understand what Paul regarded as the power source in ministry. The power source of his ministry was never himself, but the good news he carried wherever he went. Paul did not lose heart because he knew the power of the gospel to transform people's lives. Thirdly, Paul did not lose heart because he knew that his ministry would be costly, but ultimately rewarding. If you look at verse 10, Paul says, we always carry around in our body the death of Jesus. Carrying around the death of Jesus. What a strange thing to say. What do you think that means? Carrying around the death of Jesus. Well, carrying the death of Jesus in his body is Paul's way of speaking about the physical and emotional pain associated with the Christian ministry. A Christian employee may be passed over for promotion or dismissed because he's a godly person who will not bend the rules. The lost opportunity for promotion in this case is the price that you must be willing to pay. Why would you go through such a costly exercise, you may ask? Well, Paul goes on to say in the remainder of verse 10 that we should do it so that the life of Jesus may also be revealed in our body. The fact that Christians do not succumb to their problems and difficulties is the evidence that the life of Jesus is revealed within them. The way we respond to struggles and challenges can be the very evidence that the life of Jesus is within us. I think there is also a second layer of meaning when Paul talks about the life of Jesus being revealed in our body. And I think here, Paul has the future event in mind. When God's resurrection power finally delivers us from death, the life of Jesus will be manifested within us as we too are resurrected one day, and this time permanently. In Christian ministry, we need a healthy dose of realism. The reason that led Paul not to lose heart is because he understood that the Christian ministry would be costly. Costly in terms of what you must give up, but also in the way you're going to be misunderstood or abused by your non-believing colleagues, friends, or families. Paul was also realistic about how his perseverance would reveal the life of Jesus by refusing to be crushed, by refusing to live in despair, knowing that he may be persecuted but not abandoned, struck down but not destroyed. Paul knew that God could powerfully work in him and his perseverance would honor and glorify Jesus. He knew that the life of Jesus being revealed in his body is something eternal he can look forward to on the day of his resurrection. The pandemic has thrown many, many curveballs at us. When we feel disappointed, discouraged, and tempted to give up our own Christian ministry at church, at home, and at work, we'll do really well to say with Paul, since we have this ministry, we do not lose heart. Now, it's good to know about reasons for not losing heart, but what does it look like in practice, especially as we live through the pandemic? I'd like to share 3 quick tips as we adjust to life in the new normal. The recent survey I read from the Productivity Commission shows that working from home is here to stay well after the pandemic, and that the hybrid model of working is emerging as the preferred model by many employers. So how can we best serve God without losing heart in this current environment? The first tip is to remember that your life is a silent sermon. You may feel like there isn't much you can do as a Christian at this point in time, especially as the lack of physical interactions leave us with little or no chance to speak about our Christian faith. But as today's passage reminds us, how we live matters and how we work matters. For Paul, one of the ways he lived out his faith was by renouncing what he calls sacred and shameful ways. Against the opponents who accused him of dishonesty, Paul's unwavering commitment to stay true to the gospel was a silent but powerful sermon. And living out your life as a silent sermon may be as trivial as doing the dishes without grumbling. It could be the tone of your voice, body language, or choice of words as you communicate with your loved ones at home. If you are a worker who feels like evangelistic opportunities are drying up, perhaps you could talk to your clients or colleagues on Zoom with genuine honesty, patience, kindness, gentleness, filled with hope and love. The opportunity has not been taken away just because you're online. You're building a powerful and persuasive context and relationships until the time comes for you to boldly speak about the life-saving gospel with your friends, colleagues, or clients. Remember that the opportunity for you to be a silent sermon is still there. Seek to live out your life as a follower of Jesus so that others can see the life of Jesus within you. Let me quote a theologian from 19th century whose name is J.C. Ryle. In his book titled Holiness, he says this: "Our lives are a silent sermon which all can read. It is sad indeed when they are a sermon for the devil's cause and not for God's. I believe that far more is done for Christ's kingdom by the holy living of believers than we are at all aware of. There is a reality about such living which makes men feel and obliges them to think. It carries a weight and influence with it which nothing else can give. It makes religion beautiful and draws men to consider it, like a lighthouse seen far off. You may talk to persons about the doctrines of the gospel and few will listen, and still fewer understand. But your life is an argument that none can escape." That's my first tip. Do not lose heart when you feel like opportunities to bear witness to Jesus have been lost under the new normal. Remember that your life is a silent sermon. Now the second tip. Join an evangelistic community that can help you to look beyond your present challenges and struggles. The pandemic is hard on all of us, and we're all suffering one way or the other. But if you are a follower of Jesus, you can put your present sufferings in context of eternity. You know how to do so because the gospel tells us. As people of living hope, we have something to offer. You can generously offer and share the hope in Jesus by being part of an evangelistic community. In the context of church, as Ben was sharing earlier, these may be small groups that are open to people who are exploring the Christian faith. In the context of workplace, this may be a prayer group with other Christian workers where you pray for your non-Christian friends and colleagues. If you're not a follower of Jesus, could I also encourage you to have a go at joining one of these small groups that can help you investigate Christianity? See what Christians have to say about hope. Because in Christianity, hope is not an elusive word. It's not wishful thinking. That's not what hope is in Christianity. The Christian hope has substance and certainty because it points to a person called Jesus who's resurrected. And he promises forgiveness and resurrection to those who follow him. One of the practical ways not to lose heart is by keep looking for opportunities to share the treasure you carry with people around you. Join an evangelistic community. Be vulnerable and be open about your struggles. Help others see their struggles from an eternal perspective. Now the third and final tip. If you are a follower of Jesus, make it your goal to be an unofficial chaplain to your friends and colleagues. There is nothing wrong with wanting to be a champion at what you do. Someone who takes the initiative, someone who's not afraid of taking on responsibilities and accountability for what you do. If anything, Christians should be the ones doing that. But as followers of Jesus, we are actually called on to do more. As people who know the source of living hope, we should aspire to be more than a champion by becoming the unofficial chaplain. Talking about work and projects during virtual meetings is what everyone does. What makes us distinctive is the saving knowledge in Jesus. So if you are a worker, go ahead and invest your time and energy by making space to talk to your friends and colleagues about things other than work. Be an active listener as you share honestly about your own weaknesses and struggles. Find practical ways to love your neighbors. Then as your relationship with your colleagues or friends deepens, look for an opening to have the gospel conversations and share on what Jesus-centered life looks like. Christian faith encourages us to be vulnerable. Paul says we should be quick to boast about our weaknesses because Christ's power can be seen even more clearly in our lives when we do so. My third and final tip is to make it your goal to be an unofficial chaplain to your friends and colleagues. Let me now summarize before I lead us in prayer. We have every reason not to lose heart. Paul certainly didn't, because he saw his ministry as God's mercy, because he understood the true power source of his ministry, and because he knew that the ministry would be costly but ultimately rewarding. So what can you do now? Well, live your life as a silent sermon, but as a powerful sermon. Join an evangelistic community and become an unofficial chaplain to your friends and colleagues. How about I lead us in prayer? Heavenly Father, we thank you for the example of Paul, who did not lose heart even in the toughest circumstances. When we're tempted to give up or give in to the pressure of our Christian ministry at church, family, school, and work, would you help us to reflect and revel in the magnitude of mercy revealed through your Son? Enable us to see that the power does not come from within, but from the all-surpassing power of the gospel that is able to make people wise for salvation through faith in Jesus. Sustain our mortal bodies when the burden of carrying the treasure makes us weak and weary. Help us not to be afraid of suffering for the sake of the gospel, and hold on to your glorious promise that the life of Jesus may be revealed in our body. We ask all these in your precious Son's name. Amen.